Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this session so bright and early. I hope you've all had your coffee. This panel has been organized by Shebeke, the Palestinian Policy Network. Shebeke is a Palestinian think tank with a network of over 200 Palestinian experts and analysts based all over the world. And actually at this conference, there's at least a dozen or so of our members presenting. And this panel includes three of them. The title of the panel is Imagining a Palestinian Future, and actually this is one of the core themes of our work at Shebeke. Facing a constant process of erasure, Palestinians find themselves in a situation in which their past and their futures are denied. They are locked in a continuous present in which the settler colonial power, Israel, determines temporal and spatial boundaries. In such a state, surviving the ever-deteriorating present takes priority. Never do we see that more clearly today than with the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Imagining a future beyond this state is thus a rebellious and radical act and is by no means an easy one. And so today it's my pleasure to be hosting this panel with some of my very esteemed colleagues. Firstly, we're going to begin with Dr. Leila Farsakh, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She is the editor of Rethinking Statehood in Palestine, Self-Determination and Decolonization Beyond Partition, among many other publications. Dr. Farsakh's presentation today is entitled Reimagining Economic Liberation in Palestine, Obstacles and Opportunities.
Thank you very much. شكرا جزيلا للحاضرين. كلمتي حلقيها باللغة العربية وأظن بقية البانل بيكون بالإنجليزي. هدف اليوم هو مناقشة معنى التحرر الاقتصادي في فلسطين وكيف لا يمكن إعادة تصوره وتحقيقه إلا من خلال تجاوز نموذج التقسيم الذي سيطر على كل مناقشات التحرر الفلسطيني على مدى العقود الأربعة الأخيرة. كما تعلمون الاستقلال الاقتصادي كان ولا يزال هدفاً مركزياً للحركة الوطنية الفلسطينية. فمنذ إعلان الاستقلال في 1988 وبعد التوقيع على اتفاقيات أوسلو في 93 خططت المنظمة التحرير الفلسطينية والقيادة الفلسطينية الجديدة التي انتخبت في الضفة الغربية وغزة في 96 لبناء اقتصاد قوي في الضفة الغربية وقطاع غزة يكون مستقلاً عن إسرائيل وقادراً على الحفاظ على دولة فلسطينية مستقلة ومستديمة. ولكن بعد مرور 30 عاماً على إنشاء السلطة الفلسطينية في الأراضي المحتلة واستثمار أكثر من 40 مليار دولار من مساعدات دولية لمساعدة الاقتصاد الفلسطيني أن يقف على رجليه، نجد أن ما وصلنا إليه هو ضعف اقتصادي واتساع في فجوة الدخل داخل الضفة الغربية وغزة ووسط البطالة إلى مستويات لم نعرفها قبل 93. ولا يزال الاقتصاد الفلسطيني تحت رحمة السياسات والقيود الاقتصادية الإسرائيلية ومقيداً بتوسيع المستوطنات الإسرائيلية والمستوطنين المتواجدين في الضفة الغربية الذي وصل عددهم إلى 730 ألف مستوطن في 2022 مقارنة ب 250 ألف مستوطن في 1993. وطبعاً سياسات الجدار العازل الذي قسم الضفة الغربية إلى بنتستونات ليست قادرة على الاستدامة بأي معنى من المعاني الاقتصادية. النقطة المركزية التي سأطرحها في هذه المداخلة هو أن إعادة تصور المستقبل الفلسطيني الاقتصادي يستلزم أن نبني اقتصاد منصف وعادل وحساس للبيئة environmentally friendly. ولا يمكن تحقيق هذا الاقتصاد إلا من خلال الابتعاد ورفض نموذج التقسيم الذي تم اقتراحه لحل الصراع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي منذ أكثر من 7 عقود. هو يتطلب إنهاء الاستعمار الاقتصادي المهيمن الذي رسخته إسرائيل على مدى الأعوام 75 سنة الماضية، فضلاً عن الابتعاد عن الاعتماد على النزعة الاستهلاكية والديون التي تبعتها السلطة الفلسطينية كمحاولة لتنشيط النشاط الاقتصادي. نظراً لضيق الوقت سأحاول أن أقوم 3 أشياء أساسية. أولاً سأناقش كيف أن مشروع الدولة الفلسطينية الذي اعترفت به 137 دولة ودخلت إلى كدولة غير عضو في الأمم المتحدة في 2012 لم يؤتي بالتحرر الاقتصادي ولم ينهي التبعية الاقتصادية على إسرائيل، وإنما خلق تبعيات جديدة أضعفت من الاقتصاد القومي الفلسطيني بدلاً من أن تقويه. ثانياً سأراجع بعض البينات التي تدل على هذه الضعف الاقتصادي القومي وثالثاً سأؤكد على أن ضرورة تصور تحرر اقتصادي سياسي يتطلب إعادة صياغة مفهومنا للاقتصاد الفلسطيني باعتباره جزء لا يتجزأ، باعتباره أنه ليس مقتصراً على الضفة الغربية وقطاع غزة، ولكنه جزء لا يتجزأ من اقتصاد واحد في فلسطين، اقتصاد استعماري يهيمن عليه رأس المال الإسرائيلي، وهو اقتصاد غير متكافئ واستغلالي، وعلينا أن ندرس ونعيد بناء استراتيجيات جديدة لهدم هذا الاستعمار بدل من التعايش معه. ففيما يتعلق بالاقتصاد الفلسطيني، ماذا حصل على مدار السنوات 30 الأخيرة، وما هي دلائل أو مؤشرات هذا الضعف الاقتصادي؟ سأركز على 4 دلائل أساسية. أولاً هو اعتماد هذا الاقتصاد الفلسطيني على المعونات الخارجية. هذا البيان يعرض لكم ما هي نسبة المعونات الإنسانية والتنموية بين 2003 و2021، يعني قبل الحرب الأخيرة على غزة، ونرى أن الاقتصاد الفلسطيني استلم بين 2 ل 3 مليار دولار سنوياً في العقد الأخير. يعني هذا يشكل تقريباً بين 20 ل 25% من الناتج المحلي العام. هاي نسبة عالية جداً، خصوصاً أن نسبة الكمية هي 40 مليون دولار على مدار 20 سنة، هي من أكبر الكميات المادية التي وضعت في أي اقتصاد عالمي، خصوصاً بالنسبة يعني المواطنين الموجودين بفلسطين مقارنة بدول أخرى. ولكن رغم كل هذا المعونات الاقتصادية والإنسانية اللي طبعاً كانت سببها الحرب، ولكن أيضاً كان وراءها منظومة دولية من الأمم المتحدة ومن البنك الدولي، أن ضرورة دعم بناء اقتصاد فلسطيني بناء، والمعونات الاقتصادية جزء مهم في هذه المعضلة بسبب السياسات الإسرائيلية. لكن رغم كل هذا الاستثمار نرى أن الاقتصاد الفلسطيني الدخل الفردي العام في 2021 في in real terms يعني كان مستواه بنفس مستوى 1999، يعني عمليا لم يجرؤ أي تطور أو نمو قومي فعلي. ثانيا نرى أن الاقتصاد الفلسطيني اتجه في اتجاه استهلاكي بدل ما أن يتجه في اتجاه إنتاجي. عندي هون بيانين يعرضوا عدد العاملين في القطاعات الاقتصادية المختلفة، ونرى أن مجمل العاملين هم في قطاع الخدمات، وكمان الإنتاج حصص القطاعات من الناتج المحلي العام نرى أن التركيز الأساسي هو كمان قطاع الخدمات، لأنه الدينامو الأساسي للاقتصاد الفلسطيني على مدار 30 سنة الماضية كان في قطاع البنكي وكان في قطاع البناء، لم يكن في قطاع الزراعة التي انكمش حجمها في الاقتصاد الفلسطيني على مدار 30 سنة الماضية، ولا في القطاع الصناعي بسبب طبعا المعاقات الإسرائيلية التي قيدت من أي إنتاج فلسطيني. ولكن أهمية القطاع البنكي مهمة جدا، لأنه هذا النمو هذا التوسع في القطاع البنكي الذي سمح بالاستهلاك، ولكن أيضا دخلت منذ 2000 بالذات 2012 2011 منظومة المديونية، يعني المديونية هي الوسيلة لكي نخلق أي حركة اقتصادية، وهذا له عواقب اقتصادية وسياسية كبيرة. رغم كل هذا الاستثمار في القطاع البنكي والاستهلاكي نرى أن لسه الاقتصاد الفلسطيني لم يستطع أن يستغني عن احتياجاته للعمل في السوق الإسرائيلي، سوق العالم الإسرائيلي. هذا البيان يعرض العلاقة العكسية المتواجدة بين العمالة في إسرائيل ونسبة البطالة. نرى أن نسبة البطالة تخف مع نسبة مع يعني وصول العاملين إلى قطاع البناء عادة في إسرائيل. الذي حصل التغير الأساسي أو الهيكل المهم الذي حصل في الاقتصاد الفلسطيني على مدار 30 سنة أن أهل غزة لم يستطيعوا، منعوا من دخول سوق العمل الإسرائيلي، وهذا أحد الأسباب الذي يفسر لماذا هناك بطالة عالية في غزة. البطالة في غزة قبل الحرب وقبل الحصار كانت بحدود 20 إلى 25%. بعد الحصار على غزة بال2007 وصلت بين إلى 45 إلى 50%. في الضفة الغربية نسب البطالة كانت أخف، كانت بحدود 15 إلى 17%، ولكن كمان هذا السبب كان أنه قدرة العاملين الفلسطينيين أو السماح لهم في الدخول في العمل في سوق العمل الإسرائيلي، فوصلت نسبة عاملين الضفة الغربية في إسرائيل بحدود 18 إلى 20%، اللي هي نسبة شوي متساوية مع نسبة العاملين في القطاع العام. فبتشوفي مثلا هذا البيان بيفرجي إنه كيف بال91 كان ما كانش في قطاع عام عندنا بفلسطين، وما كانش عندنا بطالة، كان البطالة خفيفة جدا لأنه معظمهم كانوا بيعملوا لأنه كان في سوق عمل مشترك إذا بدك بين إسرائيل والضفة الغربية. بعد 93 وسياسة الإغلاقات وسياسة الحواجز صار في تخفيف طبعا على وقرار سياسي إسرائيلي بمنع عمال غزة الدخول إلى إسرائيل، ولكن سماح لعمال الضفة الغربية في العمل في سوق العمل الإسرائيلي، وخاصة للأسف الشديد أو يعني هذا جزء كمان من استراتيجية إسرائيلية العمل في المستوطنات. بس المهم في الموضوع وكان فكرة إنه ضرورة توسيع القطاع العام الفلسطيني لامتصاص البطالة. فنرى إنه الذي طبعا هذا له كمان انعكاسات سلبية على الاقتصاد، لأنه رفع من ميزانية السلطة الفلسطينية وأدى إلى مديونية كبيرة. بس المهم إنه صار في تخفيف في اليد العاملة في القطاع العام. بس إذا بتشوفوا في هذا البيان إنه العاملين هلأ في إسرائيل بالضفة الغربية كمان هي كلها المعلومات قبل 22 العاملين بإسرائيل، نسبة العاملين في إسرائيل أعلى من نسبة العاملين في القطاع العام، واللي بيعملوا في القطاع العام صاروا معظمهم في قطاع الأمن اللي كمان مكلف من ناحية اقتصادية. فاللي بنشوفه طبعا إنه وصلنا نتيجة إنه فيش عنا اقتصاد فلسطيني مستقل، عنا اقتصاد فلسطيني مجزأ. وأهم المعلومات النتائج اللي بنوصلها بعد 30 سنة تجربة بهذا محاولة للصعود بالاقتصاد القومي، وصلنا إلى مرحلة تأكد إنه إحنا عنا اقتصاد مجزأ. اقتصاد الضفة انعزل كليا عن اقتصاد غزة. غزة عاشت في اقتصاد اكتفائي ولكن غير منتج، نسب البطالة عالية، ولكن الاعتماد على إسرائيل انفصل وصار في اعتماد على مصر من ناحية التجارية. ولكن في الضفة الغربية ما حصل هو تجزئة. هاي صورة بتفرجي كيف تقسمت الضفة الغربية بسبب المستوطنات وسياسة الحواجز. فهاي صورة بتفرجي هاي فرجيهم أحسن شيء كيف الضفة الغربية تقسمت إلى ما أدعي عدة بنتوستانات، يعني بنتوستان يعني هي حامية سكانية زي اللي كان في جنوب أفريقيا الجنوبية، بس أصغر بكتير من ناحية جغرافية. بس النقطة الأساسية هي إنه صارت إن الفلسطينيين تحجموا في مناطق سكانية محدودة مسيجة بسياسة الإغلاقات والتشيك بوينتس، ومعتمدة على السماح السلطات الإسرائيلية بالتواصل بين الشمال والجنوب أو بين الوسط والشمال أو الجنوب. فهذا اللي بيأدينا للنقطة الثالثة اللي بدي أحكيها في هالدور، إنه إحنا اليوم عملياً في اقتصاد واحد، وهذا الاقتصاد الواحد في اقتصاد واحد بفلسطين اليوم في فلسطين التاريخية. اقتصاد واحد مكون من 5 أجزاء. فاللي عنا إياه بعد 30 سنة تجربة في هذا النمو الاقتصادي، عنا فسحات اقتصادية فلسطينية، ما عناش اقتصاد قومي فلسطيني. هذه اللي صار على مدار 30 سنة الماضية استثمار كبير أدى إلى زيادة الفجوات الاجتماعية بين الناس، إنه أدى إلى ازدهار فردي وليس إلى ازدهار قومي، وإلى تفتت اقتصادي زي ما هو تفتت سياسي. فهذا الاقتصاد الواحد اللي عندنا إياه اللي هو اقتصاد استعماري مبني على الفصل العنصري. عندنا الجانب الإسرائيلي، الاقتصاد الإسرائيلي اللي هو أو رأس المال الإسرائيلي اللي هو مهيمن ونشط وازدهر ازدهارا كبيرا في فترة أوسلو. بعدين عندنا اقتصاد غزة اللي هو الاقتصاد الفقير المحاصر المقيد، نسبة البطالة زي ما قلت 45%، نسبة الفقر كانت بحدود 80%. عندنا بعدين قطاع الضفة اللي هو كمان زي ما تشوفوا بهاي الصورة قطاع مجزأ، نسب البطالة فيه أخف، بس الفروقات الاجتماعية وفروقات الدخل فيه صارت عالية جدا. الدخل في شمال الضفة 30% أقل من الدخل في منطقة رام الله أو منطقة الخليل. بيعتمد لسه على اليد العاملة التي تعمل في الاقتصاد الإسرائيلي، ومعتمد على المعونات الخارجية اللي لسه بتدعم السلطة الفلسطينية. والسلطة الفلسطينية صار دورها الاقتصادي أكثر تسهيل لسيولة مادية ومديونية في المجتمع الفلسطيني، وأقل من وكمان على حفاظ على الأمن. صار كل الاستثمار المالي في قطاع الأمن اللي طبعا هو مش قطاع مش قطاع منتج. أوكي. وبعدين عندنا قطاع، عندنا كمان اقتصاد ثالث اللي هو اقتصاد القدس اللي احنا بننسى بنحكيش فيه، لأن القدس انقطعت كلياً عن الضفة الغربية، صارت منضمة إلى الاقتصاد الإسرائيلي بطريقة يعني شبه كاملة، بمعنى إنه صار العمال الفلسطينيين بالقدس بيشتغلوا في إسرائيل، وحتى اللي بيشتغلوا بالقدس هم إجمالاً في جانب التجاري، وكمان نسب البطالة فيه عالية مقارنة بالمجتمع الإسرائيلي. بعدين عندنا القسم الرابع اللي هو فلسطينية الداخل اللي بنحكيش فيه كتير، بس هم اقتصاد كتير مهم لأنه صار فيه تطورات مهمة من ناحية human resources، شو بسموه، الموارد البشرية. شكرا جزيلا. الموارد البشرية، إنه صار في وجود فلسطيني قوي في قطاعات معينة، هي عادة الطب والصيدلة، ولكن كمان التكنولوجيا. وكمان في تجارة مش تجارة عميقة بين الداخل وبين الضفة. وهذا يعني نقطة كتير مهمة لازم نفكر فيها، لأنه المحزن اللي صار في آخر تجربة 30 سنة لم تحاول السلطة أن تقيم هاي القدرة الشرائية الموجودة بين الداخل والضفة الغربية، وكمان العلاقات التجارية التي تكونت بين الداخل وقطاع الضفة، اللي هو جانب كتير مهم وبالنسبة إلي بيعطينا أمل لكيف نمشي لقدام. وبعدين قلنا الجانب الخامس اللي هو الجانب الإسرائيلي اللي هو اقتصاد متطور صناعي استهلاكي، بس كمان فيه رأس مال كبير عولم على مدار 30 سنة بطريقة مهمة جدا، تدل كمان إنه كيف لنا يعني شو هي هلأ إذا إحنا في وضع هلأ استعماري، كيف لنا أن نتخلص منه أو نبدأ بمواجهته. ففي هذا المجال أنا بقول في 3 شغلات مهمة لازم نتطرق لها. أولاً إنه نفهم ونقبل من اليوم ورايح إنه نصير نحكي إنه فيش عنا اقتصاد فلسطيني، عنا فسحات اقتصادية فلسطينية هدفها طبعاً هي تكمين الفلسطينيين على البقاء في أرضهم، بس أكتر من هيك ما فيهمش يعملوا. أو يعني ما نغشش حالنا ونقول إنه عنا اقتصاد فلسطيني قومي، عنا اقتصاد فردي، عنا نمو فردي، عنا ازدهار فردي. بس المفروض يصير واللي هو مهم جدا إنه كيف ممكن نمكن الناس إنه يسكنوا على الأرض، كيف ممكن نفكر بطريقة مستديمة، إنه المديونية مش هي طريقة إنه نساهم على ازدهار اقتصادي. من نفكر يمكن بأمثال من الانتفاضة الأولى، إنه كيف ناس قاموا بالمقاطعة الإسرائيلية. أظن موضوع المقاطعة صار موضوع كتير مهم. على مدار ال20 سنة اللي فاتت المقاطعة لها صدى عالمي كتير مهم. في الضفة الغربية ما لهاش لسه زخم لأنه الاقتصاد الفلسطيني معتمد كليا على الجانب الإسرائيلي، بس أظن في إمكانية لممارسة كمان المقاطعة على البضائع الإسرائيلية في الضفة الغربية من خلال تشابك أكبر مع اقتصاد وأهل الداخل. هاي نقطة كتير مهمة. والنقطة الثالثة اللي هي كتير مهمة إنه ما ننساش إنه الاقتصاد الإسرائيلي وإن هو غير معتمد بطريقة كبيرة على الاقتصاد الفلسطيني، لكنه معتمد على القضية الفلسطينية. بمعنى إذا في استقرار سياسي الاقتصاد الإسرائيلي مزدهر، بس إذا فيش استقرار سياسي فيش ازدهار إسرائيلي. وهذا شفناه هلأ مع هاي الحرب اللي أكدت إنه لها هزة اقتصادية كبيرة مش بس على الجانب الفلسطيني ولكن أيضا على الجانب الإسرائيلي. فبتأكد إنه أي مقاومة اقتصادية مربوطة بمقاومة سياسية. وتحديد المشروع الوطني الفلسطيني كمشروع تحرري يشمل كل فلسطين جزء أساسي لنبلش نفكر بكيف نمارس الاقتصاد التحرري. يعني في عمل داخلي لازم نشتغلوا بيناتنا، بس كمان في عمل يربط السياسة بالاقتصاد بطريقة معمقة ومش بطريقة سطحية. أظن هوقف هون نخلي الجميع.
شكرا ليلى. Our second panelist is Dr. Mohanad Ayash, who is Professor of Sociology at Mount Royal University in Canada. Dr. Ayash is the author of Hermeneutics of Violence and has recently finished writing Lordship and Liberation in Palestine, Israel. His presentation is entitled From the Nation State to Decolonial Sovereignties Towards a Paradigm Shift in Palestinian Nationalism. تفضل محمد.
شكرا يارا. صباح الخير. Sorry, I have to present in English. Did all my academic training in English, so it's very difficult for me to do it in Arabic. Thank you all for coming on this morning. To reinvigorate the liberatory potential of Palestinian nationalism that has withered since Oslo, my paper presents a case for what I call decolonial sovereignties to replace the nation state as a guiding structure for imagining an alternative decolonial future in Palestine. Indeed, decolonial sovereignties as a structure for liberation. Rather than focus on the nation state as the vehicle and destination of the Palestinian liberation struggle, the paper argues that decolonial sovereignties, if properly conceived and practiced, can theoretically mold and shape social and political structures, including the state and nationalism, into decolonial forms. In contrast to Euro-American settler colonial sovereignty, which is absolute and indivisible in its aspirations and eliminatory of indigenous people in its practices, decolonial sovereignties are layered, shared, and multiplying in both their aspirations and practices. In settler colonies, the sovereignty of the sovereign is indivisible, absolute, and omnipresent in its aspirations and practices. Of course, no power is in fact indivisible, absolute, and omnipresent in practice. Resistance to such power ensures this. But the key here is that settler colonial sovereignty aspires to that kind of power, which can be observed, among other things, in the audacity of its operations. For example, the very idea of eliminating complex societies in their entirety, banishing them to the dustbin of history as uncivilized and savage, and forcing the survivors to become civilized in the mold of Euro-American ideas, to even think of carrying out such a project of total elimination and the creation of quote-unquote man in their own Euro-American image shows the settler sovereign's aspiration towards powers that most human societies have reserved only for the realm of the gods. In its aspirations towards absolute and indivisible power, the settler sovereign cannot tolerate the very idea, let alone the existence or operation of indigenous sovereignty. And this is the case, of course, with Zionism, which is a colonial project born of and designed for Euro-American colonial modernity. The Zionist project is about creating an absolute, indivisible Israeli Jewish sovereign, a sovereign that can never tolerate a shared, overlapped, or layered sovereignty with the indigenous Palestinian people. Wherever Zionist settler sovereignty expands, it must necessarily eliminate indigenous Palestinian sovereign claims to the land. It is important to emphasize that indigenous sovereignty does not represent or present an opposing force to settler sovereignty in the sense that they're both vying for the same kind of sovereignty, but represents an alternative form of sovereignty altogether. Sovereignty should not be reduced to its Euro-American version. As a broad concept, it precedes the rise of Euro-American imperialism. And I understand it as sovereignty being about how a collective understands the fundamental relationship between land and people and the relationships between the people who inhabit that land. And generally speaking, the forms of indigenous sovereignties that settler colonial sovereignty seeks to eliminate concern reciprocal, shared, and overlapping relationships between people and land and among people. And in my forthcoming book that Yara mentioned, Lordship and Liberation in Palestine and Israel, I argue that decolonial sovereignties can be observed in the popular committees of the First Intifada, which Leila very briefly brought up there in terms of their the economic alternative they posed to Israeli settler colonial economic policies. Very briefly, because I know people here are very familiar with the popular committees, they carried out the functions of sovereignty. Over 2 years of their flourishing and their existence. They ensured food security, community-based conflict resolution and mediation, equitable distribution of basic resources. They created and developed and actually what looked like, for a couple of years anyway, an independent Palestinian economy, providing services such as education and health, and improving community safety, not to mention, of course, carrying out the uprising and the struggle. And crucially, in all of these activities, they emphasized collective well-being and the common good over and above neoliberal calculations and individualistic concerns. This is a really critical point that distinguishes decolonial sovereignties from settler colonial sovereignty, the decolonial alternative from the Euro-American world in which we inhabit. And as I mentioned, there are three main features of this practice and aspiration of decolonial sovereignties. They're shared, layered, and multiplying. These three features critically distinguish decolonial sovereignties from settler colonial sovereignty on the axis of aspirations. That is, it may well be the case that in practice, settler colonial sovereignty is also layered, shared, and multiplying, but never in its aspirations. It always aspires to be absolute, indivisible, and omnipresent. In contrast, decolonial sovereignties actually operate on aspirations that are themselves layered, shared, and multiplying. To summarize this very quickly in terms of the popular committees, when it comes to the sovereignties being layered, they were layered in the sense that, they overlapped and worked with other social and political bodies that carried out the functions of sovereignty, such as political factions, trade unions, community organizations, and so on. There was never an aspiration to replace any of these other bodies or place them under the umbrella, of the unified national leadership of the uprising, the UNLU. Second, these sovereignties were shared in the sense that the functions of sovereignties were determined and carried out by the people and for the people. The voice of the people was always the most cherished and respected voice. You can see this in the communiques of the UNLU. Because it was the voice that represents the collective will and guides the collective towards a liberated decolonial life. And there never appeared, at least in those first 2 years, an aspiration on behalf of the UNLU to replace the voice of the people with any kind of dictatorial sovereign voice that is the marquee feature of all sovereign states today. Finally, the popular committees were multiplying in the sense that the sovereign was not one in absolute, as happens with settler colonial sovereignty, and I would say dominant forms of sovereignty today, but rather their communal character encouraged their multiplication across Palestine. The communiques were always telling the communities, keep producing. Wherever there are committees, produce more. It never had this aspiration to shut down the multiplication of sovereignty. So in approximately the 2 years that these committees flourished, they offered a decolonial alternative to the Euro-American nation state in terms of how to organize the social and political spheres. As decolonial sovereignties, they acted as a structure for decolonial liberation. They were the liberated future that Palestinians aspired to. They built that world, for me, Palestinian decolonial liberation has always meant the commencement of this new radical understanding of how social and political life can be organized. So what do we do with the question of the state, of the Euro-American state? And this paper argues that the question of the state ought to be downgraded to secondary importance behind the question of sovereignties. The state is but one form of organizing social and political life. We've got to stop looking at it as somehow this gold standard that the Euro-American imperial project has convinced us that it is. It's not. It's not the gold standard by any stretch. And we have to start to think about these questions in more broader terms, like how do we organize the social and political spheres, and how do we understand the relationship between the social and the political? And generally speaking here, I won't get into the details, I understand the social as the sphere in which the collectivity of individuals is formed, sustained, and continuously reinvigorated. And the political as the sphere which specializes in fulfilling certain necessary functions in order for collectivity to nourish and grow. For example, mobilizing and distribution of resources, community safety, health and well-being, independent economies, and so on. But again, more than their general definitions, I'm much more interested, and I think social and political theory in general has always been more interested in the relationship between the two spheres, which can be summarized as this. When a collectivity of people forms itself as an organized social group or formation, how do they formulate and practice the political operation of their collective affairs? The Euro-American modern nation state is a structure that essentially operates by separating the social from the political. The political sphere becomes the arena of decision-making that stands above the social sphere, administrating the social sphere. And although it sets the social sphere as the site of its responsibility, the political necessarily falls short of representing the social sphere in a full democratic sense by virtue of its opposition over and above the social sphere. And prominent social and political theorists within the West have long made the case that the modern nation state fails to represent the needs and aspirations of the majority and rather constitutes a form of power that deprives the majority of their autonomy, liberty, and freedom. And though debates rage between different theoretical traditions over the extent and nature of the separation between the sphere of governance and the sphere of the governed within Euro-American states, this is of less concern to this paper because working from a decolonial perspective, it is much more significant to emphasize that the level of democratic governance and attendance to the needs and desires of the collectivity in Euro-American states should first and foremost be understood within the context of colonialism, neocolonialism, settler colonialism, and imperialism. We cannot understand, this is why it should never be the gold standard. We cannot understand the emergence of democratic nation states in Euro-America, so-called democratic. There is more democracy in the popular committees than the whole bunch of them combined. We cannot understand the emergence of so-called democratic nation states in Euro-America, where there exists to varying degrees and levels a robust and functioning welfare system, a system of some kind of accountability and so on, without considering the fact that the wealth generated in the colony, settler colony, and imperialism enabled and continues to enable the formation of such systems. Historically, Euro-American states dealt with their class tensions by exporting them to the colony, by spreading the wealth generated through colonialism and imperialism and, of course, slavery, though inequitably, among its own population. They were able to diminish the use of forceful coercion in resolving their class conflicts and transition to a consensus-based form of government which became known as democracy. Thus, even if we view the American modern state as desirable, effective, orderly, or relatively speaking fair, a form of organizing social and political life and a form of organizing social and political life that ought to be replicated in Palestine and elsewhere, it is not clear to me by any stretch that this structure can be replicated as the way it looks in Euro-American states without the wealth generated from the colonial and imperial project and the exportation of internal conflicts to the colony. For me, the task of the colonized is to reimagine, as Fanon and Said and many other revolutionary thinkers have argued for a long time, is to reimagine not the Euro-American state as such, but to go back to the more abstract question of the social and political. The question becomes how to reimagine and practice the social-political relationship, not as oppositional, where the political rules over the social, but as complementary, where the social and the political operate in a different kind of relationship, as it did in the, as I argue, in the popular committees of the First Intifada. And for me, this question critically ignites questions about the nature of our relationship to the land, as well as our relationship with and between each other as diverse collective identities with multiple national consciousnesses. And this should and does in fact, I argue, drive us away from the exclusive, indivisible sovereignty of colonial modernity. For me, in its decolonial form, national consciousness does not seek to establish what I call in the book lordship over another national consciousness, to eliminate and replace it as the settler colonial sovereignties. We can see through decolonial sovereignties an imagination and practice of a form of belonging that refuses the logics, grammar, and violences of lordship in establishing our belonging and collective identities, visions, and aspirations. If the Palestinian project is to travel down truly a decolonial path, as it has done before, of course, but I see it as this is kind of a dangerous moment where I think, not this moment, but for the last, since Oslo, we're going off that path. Not only does it have the potential to liberate Palestinian social and political life, it can revolutionize social and political life as such. The reinvigoration of the Palestinian national project would be none other than the much-needed reinvigoration of a global decolonial project, which itself, dare I say, has become stagnant since the formation of post-colonial states in the 20th century. I know many will see my work and what I'm arguing as wishful thinking, as somehow a grandiose call that expects more and, importantly, asks too much of the colonized Palestinians to change the course of history. That this argument is not really tethered to reality. But in my view, that view of my argument could not be further from the truth. The place from which I am making this normative and theoretical case is indeed firmly placed in the reality of the Palestinian condition. The Palestinian nation-state project, in the mold of the Euro-American state, has been ongoing for over 100 years now. And not only are we no closer to achieving it today, we are farther away from it than ever before. And with each passing decade since at least the 1920s, the establishment of a Palestinian nation-state in the mold of Euro-American sovereignty moves farther and farther from realization. Today, the project is a mirage, it's dead. Worse, over the decades, especially since Oslo, this project has more or less followed what Israel and the international system has pushed the Palestinian liberation movement towards, a brokered and limited type of sovereignty, a cheap replica of Euro-American sovereignty that would serve the interests of the Israeli settler colonial project, which is itself a cog in the international system built and developed of and for the project of Euro-American imperial hegemony. The real wishful thinking for me is to hold on to this project. If we are not going to gain our freedom and liberation in this world as it is currently structured, then the only sensible course of action, as I see it, is to start a movement that changes the world, because the world as currently configured, the world of colonial modernity, does not have a place for Palestinians. We must therefore create a world guided by decolonial sovereignties, and in this project, I argue that we will not find many allies in existing states, but shall find allies in the multitudes of people being suffocated under the rule of modern nation states. The intensified and mass-scale genocidal attack on Palestinians that began in October and is still ongoing has made very clear one of the paper's main assertions. The world as currently configured does not have a place for Palestinians. The Arab states have stood by while the Israeli state and the US empire have unleashed unimaginable horror and violence against the Palestinian people. Though many states have issued strong words of condemnation, and some, led by South Africa, have participated in maneuvers at the international, diplomatic, and legal levels to stop the genocide, many more actions are needed and yet not taken. Most critically, we have not seen any significant action to isolate the Israeli state economically. We have not seen any military intervention, except from some armed militias in the region. It is clear that states are not going to come to the rescue and help advance the Palestinian struggle for liberation. It is clear, of course, that Western states are determined on destroying us as a people. What we have seen, however, is a very large and growing grassroots support for Palestine all over the globe. The Palestinian struggle is itself becoming a political consciousness for millions of people around the world. By this I mean that the Palestinian struggle has become the way in which people have come to see and understand the power relations under which they live, and a symbol for their own aspirations from their liberation from their own oppressive political and social institutions. Many, and I'm coming to the end here, many across the world are seriously questioning the validity and the legitimacy of their state structures. The consequences of these shifts are difficult to ascertain at the moment, but they are coming. And I think we should nurture them and develop and help them develop so that they become sustained over long periods of time. If people's political consciousness is shaped by the Palestinian struggle as a Palestinian struggle for a radical and revolutionary decolonization of the world, then I believe we have taken a major step towards the liberation of Palestine and indeed the dismantling of colonial modernity. Sure, there are no guarantees about what I'm talking about, but this is how I see it. If we fail on the path that we are currently on, and we are failing, as a state-centered national project trying to have a cheap replica of Euro-American nation-state, we will be, I believe, an abandoned cause and people who, if at all remembered, will be remembered for not managing to take a seat in an unjust and, I would say, dying age of colonial modernity. If we fail as a national project for decolonial liberation in this age of colonial modernity, we will at least leave our mark by revealing and illuminating the deep injustices and violences of this current world system of colonial modernity. So I say, let us leave behind the urgency, will, vision, and aspiration to radically transform the world of colonial modernity. Let us at least be the forebearers for those who will eventually succeed in radically transforming it. Thank you.
Thank you, Muhannad. Last but not least, we have Dr. Noor Joudeh, who is Assistant Professor at the Department of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Joudeh wrote her dissertation on Mapping Decolonized Futures, Indigenous Visions for Hawaii and Palestine. Her presentation today is entitled Honoring Past, Escaping Presents, and Dwelling in Futures, the Palestine Land Society Village Reconstruction Competition.
شكرا يارا. Can we get the PowerPoint up? شكرا كتير لكم. Thank you. شكرا ليارا ولكم ومهند وليلى all for being here as we try to navigate our days through this war and genocide. What I'm presenting today is set within a larger project that Yara mentioned and is guided first and foremost by embracing indigenous futures and having faith in the potential of the past and present to create something new moving forward. The sumud and optimism at its core is, I think, incredibly difficult for us in this moment. And yet, at the same time, the questions that come out of the work are precisely the kind we are grappling with constantly, and much more so in the last several months. Mahmoud Darwish once wrote that in a minute, the whole life of a house ends, and that a house murdered is also mass murder, something that we have seen in inexplicable ways over the last 4 months. He goes on, as the memory of things get murdered, they scatter in fragments like beings. Items break like their owners break, because all these things are the memories of people who were emptied of things and the memories of things that were emptied of people. Now, I think for us and for many, nostalgia and imagining the future are often seen as these opposed temporalities and spaces. However, critical acts of remembering, especially with indigenous struggle, is an inextricable part of imagining the future and working to realize it. So I want to present to you today some key points here in the ways that we think about time and experience it In the same way that settler colonialism destroys to replace indigenous spaces, so Israeli settler colonialism destroying Palestinian spaces, I argue that it does the same with producing time. It does not just erase histories or create mass dispossession, even in a variety of forms beyond land. It refuses the possibility of an indigenous future, and it works to destroy a holistic temporality or sense of time. The Palestine Land Society competition, which I'm going to lay out here, exemplifies how mapping can serve as an imaginative and generative practice, but also how the past can be activated as a move toward liberated futures. Understanding that indigenous resurgence is not about a return to the past, but a way to escape the rigidity of the present, of the colonial present. I argue that countermapping by way of imagining future spatial expressions is both a form of resurgence and a challenge to the narrative of linear settler time. So the competition, for which you see a flyer here, began in 2017, and it charges young Palestinian architecture students with reconstructing and designing the destroyed villages of 48. As an initiative, it builds on PLS's and Salman Abu Sitta's decades-long work to archive, to publish, and reframe mostly British mappings, but is now taking a step toward reviving pre-Nakba spaces. As a large majority of the hundreds of villages were never built over by Israeli settlers, the competition is also challenging the argument of unavailable space for refugee return. The current project is the fruit not only of documentation in things like the Atlas of Palestine and more recent work on the Palestine Exploration Fund, but it is a larger project at PLS to engage in material possibilities for return. With almost 10,000 files of archival material, PLS has robust folders on approximately 480 destroyed villages. Participating students are given historical data, hand-drawn maps from living survivors, many of which are taken from hundreds of village histories, which I'm sure that many of you have seen, British mandate surveys, current Google satellite imagery, and demographics of the residents and descendants, so projections of how many people would live in the village today. Abu Sitta, PLS's founder, told me the competition follows naturally from the process of documentation. We asked ourselves, what do we do with all of these village files? We have to find a way to make them usable, and this is where we ended up. Currently, 8 universities are participating, 5 in Palestine, 2 in Jordan, and 1 in Lebanon. This expanded to include Palestinians in the US and Europe since 2020. University students majoring in architecture and urban planning redesign these villages on the same village site, but with updated services using the data on projected population. The submissions include the design for rebuilding the village today, as well as a written component which considers historical characteristics of the location. So, using my access to the maps and reports and data briefs provided by PLS to participants, as well as the final submission of these students, I look at what past and present information they incorporate and prioritize in their designs. I also incorporate dozens of individual interviews and focus groups to the competition and projects. These focus on the students' decisions and motivations for participation, their design considerations, and perhaps most importantly, their understanding of the competition's usefulness or lack thereof to the larger struggle for refugee right of return. So let's start taking a look at some of these. While PLS has set certain parameters for the participants, students are largely free to explore and interpret as they see fit. They are asked to keep villages on the original site and lands, preserving any remaining landmarks, so if a house is still there, if there's any shrines, but also to incorporate as much data as possible. Despite these very limited parameters and a wide array of ways that the students could take their designs, an incredibly diverse set of submissions in the last 6 years, a large majority of the submissions do have a series of common key features. Some are less surprising, right? So public squares, museums, attempts to address new road systems, use of oral histories, satellite images. But perhaps the most interesting commonality is the presence of what they call guest houses or reunion hostels for refugees or Palestinians in diaspora who choose not to return permanently but would need housing when visiting, showing a very deep awareness of the complicated questions that would arise with reconstruction. Echoing Abu Sitta's guiding ethic that you document to know what you lost and therefore to find ways to recover it, all of the participants I spoke to insisted that for them, this project felt different and not another cultural endeavor or remembrance of the Nakba. So before we take a look at some of the designs, I want to introduce you to the suggestion and contribution that I'm making in this part of the project for how we understand what we call in geography dwelling space. And its relation to time. So let's start with an individual author named Tim Engold, who calls, has a differentiation between this idea of dwelling versus building perspective. And the difference here is mainly the idea of creating meaning through activity versus creating meaning that has, versus meaning that has been previously attached. So he defines the dwelling perspective as one that treats the immersion of the organism, person in an environment or a life world, which is an important concept here, as an inescapable condition of existence. Basically, from this perspective, the world comes into being around the inhabitant, right, around all of us. And everything within our life world gains significance and meaning through our participation in a regular pattern of life activity. On the other side of this is what he calls the building perspective, which is the more widely applied understanding in anthropology, sociology, and other spaces, in which people are understood to inhabit a world in which form and meaning have already been attached. Basically, the idea here is that they have to construct the world before they can act in it. He even goes as far as using the architect specifically as a prime example of this building perspective. And he says that the architect wants to first plan and build houses and then import people to occupy them. He says this does not accurately reflect human experiences of people's relationship to the environment, since it is in the process of physically dwelling that individuals and communities build, and it is only in the capability of dwelling, of living, that one can build. So, if we think of houses as living organisms with life histories and unfolding relations, as Ingold does and as Darwish does, then what do we make of houses that are taken, destroyed, erased? And here I want us to think back to the words of mass murder and memories emptied. What I'm arguing is that this destruction, particularly in the collective a collective form of indigenous spaces, really requires us to expand our understanding of inhabiting and also what it means to dwell before building. Nachi Bluebarnd, who is the author of Native Space, explains that inhabiting as a frame used for establishing belonging or home or a relation to place, whether that's rooted in possession of land or indigeneity as an identity, is a way that signals differing notions of relationship, of land, and the related processes of legitimacy or legitimization to have bodily presence in specific locations, whether that is an individual bodily presence or a collective presence. Now, at first glance, I think it can seem to a lot of us that the competition could be understood as this quintessential embodiment of the building perspective, right? Architecture students, planning, so on. But as you listen to these young architects describe their process, another vision takes place and takes shape entirely. These spaces are not empty abstractions to be organized, nor are their buildings devoid of life simply because the refugees are presently absent. Instead, they are windows to paused life worlds, deprived of the daily interactions that come with dwelling, but constantly overflowing with collective relations and the legitimization that typically comes with bodily presence. Exile and refugee experience cause a need for us as Palestinians to embody dwelling precisely in a manner that supersedes the mere fact of physical occupation of spaces. and it grounds dwelling in a temporality or experience of time that is not confined by the present. Mark Rifkin describes indigenous duration as operating less as a chronological or linear sequence than as overlapping networks of affective connection, of emotional connection to persons, non-human entities, to places, and that orient one's way of moving through time and space. He argues that through storying, indigenous peoples reclaim and remake settler colonial violence to a shared language and temporality that allows for futures and possibility. And so I would add here that mapping practices also do this work. As Palestinians, of course, we call this indigenous duration sumud. More than mere survival, it embodies connection and an ongoing sense of presence. It is steadfastness, but it is steadfastness always rooted in moving forward, in a sense of time in which we experience the past, present, future, all at once and always together. Until now, the idea of mapping quote-unquote dwelling spaces in geography as momentary expressions that are produced through relation and interaction has really been limited at looking at existing residential land and shifting paths of plant gathering at rural sites. But what I'm proposing here is that the concept lends itself particularly well to counter-mapping efforts by indigenous communities who are working to both remember pasts and imagine futures simultaneously. In this competition, the participants and their designs take the concept of dwelling space into the future in a very literal sense. The narratives and images that I want to show you now exemplify what I'm calling a dwelling to rebuild perspective. This production of space this production of space and the Palestinians who inhabit it reflect a reality of displacement and dispossession, which is that the spaces that we indigenous communities map and dwell are never confined to the moment that we are currently living. Dwelling space here is not only a momentary expression of houses and lands that were emptied in a distant past, it is a vision of rebuilding and reviving those spaces and the interactions and relationships that once filled them. This one here, actually, we'll get into some specific ones, but just to share. This one is of Al-Qastal, near Jerusalem, and I don't have time to get into this one today, but it's a particularly beautiful one in that the entire design is described as a journey. So what happens to you as you kind of walk into the village is meant to also tell a particular story. The second place prize, this is Ain Ghazal. The second place prize in 2019 went to a group of 5 students, Noor Balshi, Christina Batikha, Karine Mata, Carmen Mata, and Elia Musa from the American University of Beirut. The first group submission to the competition in its first 3 years. Since then, almost every year now is filled with majority group submissions, which is something significant we'll get to in a second. This was also a unique interview process as I had an opportunity to speak with the students both before and after they completed their design. All 5 of the students were drawn to participate in the competition partly for political reasons or family heritage, but more than anything, they were captivated by the idea of challenging themselves to design an emptied space at such a large scale. Until now, projects in their classes focused on much smaller scales, but the opportunity to imagine the life world of an entire village was something they said they couldn't pass up. They told me what makes their design so special is that it is not a reflection of one perspective, for example, the way that the Al-Qasda design is, but 5. Part of Abu Sitta's vision for this competition has been to not only show the possibilities of reconstruction, but to strike debate and conversation amongst all of us over what this could look like. To hear these students to talk as a group is perhaps one of the most representative moments of this aspect. The ethics of group work was very important to us, they explained. Not any one of the villagers will have liberated Palestine. That will be the manifestation of an entire nation's will. We cannot deny the power of working together now or when they return. If each of us had been working alone, we would not have had the conversations we did that led to critical things in design, like drowning the road, this road that you see here in the image. This Israeli road, which cuts through the village's lands today, is a key component in their design. They decided to literally drown the road and revive the Ain, or spring, for which the town was named. The students propose rebuilding Ain Ghazal by reviving its source of life first, a new spatial interpretation of the Ain, explaining that it was not only homes and buildings destroyed, but that the landscape was also disfigured, and that the road now cuts through the fertile terraces which used to bear many fruit and olive trees. The structure they design and seen here serves as both a housing tower for returning refugees, as well as a functional reservoir to collect rainwater, reconnect the landscape, and, quote their words, not mine, act as a bridge between the past of the village and its future. In their second interview, having now completed the design and waiting for the competition results, they were eager to show me what they'd accomplished. 6 months earlier, they had practically no specific design to share, but were excited by participation, and now I found them jumping out of their seats to describe and point to image details. As you're driving through the main road, the first thing you're going to see is our project, which is intended to be the gate of the village. When you look inside, you see a big void. From this void, you see the whole project up to the last floor. The top is what they have as the Saha, as the town square. As you go through, you're going to see a welcoming facade that draws you inside the project. This is made out of mesh, and it helps plants grow on it so that it becomes more organic and vernacular as plants are brought back to life by the water itself. The whole project becomes alive, and you can see the life through the facade. It's mostly transparent and meant to blend in with natural surroundings. As a whole, the project is condensed into this one singular structure, retaining the water behind. And they say we are binding the village together, bringing old inhabitants together with the market, not in the traditional way that a village is spread out over the landscape, but rather what they've done here is condense the village to this wall to retain and create this body of water that is to revive Ain Ghazal. They did something, the reason that I like to highlight this particular design is they did something in their village mapping that no other group or submission has done to date. They do not detail a layout of homes and facilities. As the most collaborative of the submissions at that point to that time, not just with each other, but also with the future residents of the village. The students believed strongly that the Palestinians returning had to have a voice in rebuilding their homes and what that would look like in the long run. Therefore, the structure and village vision that they submitted centered organic growth post-return. Quote, I think had we planned the village, it would have been very ironic because it would have looked like an Israeli settlement. That is also a main motive because we do not want the people of Ain Ghazal to be forced to live in a way that doesn't look like them. They will have been immigrants in other places and adopted new ways of living, but when they come back to Ain Ghazal, they're not going to lose themselves suddenly just because they've returned to the motherland. We felt the best thing we could do is empower the villagers with our architecture and give them the tools to feel secure and face whatever present oppression they were still undergoing. Ain Ghazal in the old days and years and centuries grew through natural growth and expansion, and that's how we believe the village should grow again, and so we wanted to give the people of the village the option to do that. I'm very over time, so I'm just going to, I have to mention this particular design. It was very interesting. Beit Jibreen was designed by a young man named Lu'aydik at Bir Zayt in 2018. This one is unique because his is a conceptual approach that really pulls in surrounding areas. He admits very quickly that he doesn't presume to know how this would play out, but he centers at the core of his reconstruction the need of a revitalization of relationships A lot of what actually Leila and a bit of what Muhannad talked about, the historical role of a village economically and its relationship to surrounding towns. He says, how can we revive not just the villages, but the relations and these district spaces? Here, Luay's solution in a decolonized future is not only to revive connection, but he presents the idea of actually using the destroyed villages as linking, what he calls linking entities, to confront fragmentation and relink the already fragmented enclaves of the West Bank with the occupied lands of 48. So with Beit Jibrin, if you see the top, he views Beit Jibrin as a potential link between El Khalil and Asqalan or El Majdal. And he does this in a variety of ways, in this particular case as a transit stop between an economic hub and a coastal city. He views it as a place that could become a market for the products of both cities and a warehouse in the village. He extends the function of these linking entities to advancing sustainability and pitching the village site as a location for a power plant that could have solid waste disposal and reuse, bonding the entities together rather than pushing us to think about these spaces as separate. So he really takes the dwelling to rebuild perspective a step further and asks us to imagine a set of inter-village relations. I'm going to skip some of this final theory stuff, but basically with hundreds of villages destroyed and depopulated, the revival of these spaces is central to notions of return and a map that reflects the population of which it was emptied. These conversations and the designs that come from them are now also being presented to the Palestinian community. So these young men and women who are conducting these designs are Zooming with refugees. For example, one of the young women in Gaza who won last year had a Zoom session with the descendants of the village that she was redesigning in Lebanon, in a mukhayyam in Lebanon. And they actually presented this design. She had a Q&A session with the descendants. They had a whole conversation kind of about it. And so, these mapping practices, what they are really doing is insisting not only on a decolonial future, but on the idea of redotting the map, not just with historic places, but with future histories as well. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you to all of you for listening. I know we've gone over time. Funnily enough, my colleagues last night said to me that they wouldn't speak for so long, but I think it just shows their passion for the topics. And I want to thank all of you, Muhannad, Noor, Leila. I think each presentation really offered an avenue into thinking about the future in the face of the Zionist settler colonial regime's furious attempts to deny a Palestinian future. I'm going to open the floor to questions. I think we can take a couple of rounds. Okay, we'll start with Arish. Oh, sorry, just to say that all of us are happy to take questions in both languages.
صباح الخير، شكراً على هيك سيشن بجنن على الصبح، وشكراً على تفكيركم نحو المستقبل. عندي سؤال لمهند وسؤال لنور. مهند، ليش مثلاً decolonial sovereignty ومش popular sovereignty؟ أعمال بشارة بتحكي على popular sovereignty، تحديداً أعطيت نموذج الانتفاضة الأولى. يعني ممكن أنا شفتها ديكولونيال لأنه التنظيم اللي كان هو بالعلاقة مع المستعمر، ما كان بالعلاقة مع يعني بالفصل عن الاستهلاك من المستعمر. في كان ناقصني تعريف السوفرنتي تاعك، وكمان إذا بنحكي على السوفرنتي تبعت الانديجينس كيف معرفة دوليا وقانونيا ممكن تكون إشكالية بالسياق الفلسطيني. ففي هيك شوية يعني هاي الملاحظة لنور، بحب يعني أفهم من خلال استعمالكم للسوفرنتي والإنديجينس سوفرنتي كيف بتشوفوها. بس بجملة بقول إنه حسب التعريف الدولي للإنديجينس سوفرنتي هو تعريف ثقافي ومش سيادي تيريتوريال على الأرض بالمفهوم الفلسطيني الناشونال. فهذا يعني كان شوي هيك مش يعني استمتعت في المداخلة نظرياً، بس تطبيقياً في التعامل مع فلسطين كيف منفكر في الديكولونيال سوفرنتي بعد شوي بحب أسمع أكتر، صعب بإطار الوقت. نور كمان استمتعت كتير. أنا بعرف إنه ما أخذت نماذج لفلسطينيين أعادوا تخيل فلسطين القرى المهجرة قبل ال 48 لفلسطينية ال 48. بدي أسألك، وفي إشي انترستينج، المشاريع اللي حكيت عنها كمان مرة أي سنوات؟ وفي إشي مثير إنه بالنسبة لإلي يعني لما قعدت أسمع المداخلة إنه زخروت وهي مؤسسة يهودية تعيد إحياء ذكرى النكبة في الشارع في المجتمع الإسرائيلي، بلشت هذا المشروع زمان قبل 10-15 سنة إذا ذاكرتي مش خينيتني. ففيها فلسطينية بس المبادرة كانت من يهود إسرائيليين، وأنا وقتها بتذكر إنه بلشوا حتى قبلنا في إعادة بناء تخيل فلسطين. فبحب يعني في نماذج مشابهة على فكرة من الإيربن واللي شفتوا التصميم. بحب أعرف إذا عندك اطلاع على المشروع وليش اخترتي إنه ما تتطرق إلى له، لأنه كمان فيه فلسطينية، لأنه الفلسطينية بيعيدوا بناء الحياة.
شكرا أريج. في سؤال دكتور، تفضل.
أول سؤال ليلى. منطق الإحلالي اللي بيربط العلاقة بين المستعمر وبيننا تحول خلال هاي الحرب من أدوات الترانسفير والسيبريشن الإبعاد لأدوات الجينوسايد. وتجربة تجربة أستراليا وكندا بتفرجينا إنه المستعمر لما يدوق دم الجينوسايد زي بكندا لحديت السبعينات وبأستراليا للثمانينات ببطل يقدر يرجع لأدوات أخرى غير الجينوسايد. الظاهر إنه بوقت الجينوسايد عم بيرتكب بغزة بيتم تحضير الانفراستراكتشر لجينوسايد بالضفة الغربية عن طريق الهجوم وعن طريق فتح شوارع داخل المخيمات. هذا الانتقال الروبيكون اللي تخطى المشروع الصهيوني بهاي الحرب كيف يعني رؤيتك لكيف يتداعى؟ السؤال الثاني لمهند. أحد الفشل المقتل عند النخب الفلسطينية مقارنة بجنوب أفريقيا هي عدم وضع الأيديولوجية العدو كجزء محوري بأي علاقة مستقبلية. يعني الANC كانت مستعدة تتفاوض على كل شيء إلا the dismantlement of apartheid as an ideological framework. منظمة التحرير ومثقفين الفلسطينية فشلوا بوضع the dismantlement of Zionism كمحوري وخلوا الدولة هي المحور، وكانوا مستعدين يعني يتحركوا حوالين المشروع الصهيوني لا يقدروا يبنوا دولتهم بوجود المشروع الصهيوني. فأهمية فلسطينيا نزع أو إعادة محورية يعني dismantlement of Zionism قبل بناء أي ترتيبات مرتبطة بالحكم بتصير هي تلقائيا بعد ما تشيل هاي الأيديولوجية. والشغلة الثانية لنور، أنا حضرت لما قدموا لسكان سحماتها أظن بالبداوي، وبتقدر تشوف يعني كيف جزء من صمود الدياسبورا بيخلق هذا المشروع حافز نضالي للتمسك بفكرة العودة، بدل ما يكون جزء نوستالجيا وإرثي، بيكون جزء من النضال المستقبلي. فأنا يعني من حاول يعني استكمالا لهذا المشروع تاعك لقراءة هذا البرنامج، هو فهم تلقي سكان هاي القرى لهذا المشروع. شكرا.
We'll take one more question. تفضل.
صباح الخير. يعني أنا استمتعت كتير بالتقديم اللي قدمتوه. شكرا كتير لكم أنتم الثلاثة. بدي أوجه سؤال للدكتورة ليلى بأخذ التحرر الاقتصادي الفلسطيني أو تحرير الاقتصاد الفلسطيني. في عنا نقاط أساسية، يعني جزء منها أخطأنا إحنا كفلسطينيين، وجزء منها كانت سياسة مفروضة علينا. سياسة المانحين كانت سياسات إغاثية وليست سياسات تطويرية. في كل الوقت المنح اللي للإغاثة أكبر كتير من المنح للتطوير، أو إذا كان التطوير بيكون تطوير غير إنتاجي يعني بكثير من الحالات. المنح اللي بتنعطى للبنوك، يعني جزء كبير من المنح كانت بتمنح للبنوك والمؤسسات المالية بهدف الإقراض، الأساميز وغيرها، بس كانت البنوك بتتحرر من هاي القيود وبتصير القروض لأشياء استهلاكية، شراء سيارة، شراء بيت، شراء، وكأنه شراء السيارة أصبح جزء من تطوير مؤسسة صغيرة. بدناش يعني نغفل الكوربشن أو الفساد اللي موجود عندنا كمان، وديون السلطة، يعني ديون السلطة سواء من البنوك أو من المؤسسات المالية، حتى مؤسسات السلطة زي صندوق التأمين والمعاشات. النقطة اللي بدي أطرحها إنه هل عدم وجود العملة الفلسطينية له تأثير؟ لأنه إحنا بنتعامل بالشيكل في معظم الحالات، وإسرائيل بتتعمد، أو البنك المركزي الإسرائيلي بيتعمد عدم نقل الشيكل، وبالتالي بيقعد عنا 18 شهر 19 شهر وبالمليارات تكون موجودة في مخازننا، عبارة عن ورق إسرائيلي مخزن ليس له قيمة، وبيعطوناش عليه أي نوع من الانترست في خلال الفترة هذه. وعدم سيطرتنا على المعابر اللي كمان سواء في ميناء أو مطار أو حاجة أو حتى الكروسينجز. هل سؤالي هنا، هل ممكن إنه تكون أحد نتائج الحرب اللي دائرة في غزة أو الإبادة اللي دائرة في غزة كتطلع مستقبلي أن نعيد صياغة الكثير، ليس فقط من الناحية السياسية بل من الناحية الاقتصادية، أن نعيد صياغة التوجه الفلسطيني نحو اقتصاد حر بشكل أفضل؟ شكرا.
شكرا. بلش ليلى.
هحاول أجاوب على الأسئلة لأنها شوي مترابطة مع بعض، بس كمان المشكلة الأساسية إنه منظومة أوسلو كانت منظومة مبنية على تقسيم وإعادة يعني إعادة طبيعة التقسيم، مش إنهاء التقسيم. يعني الفدا ما كانش إنه ينفصل الاقتصاد الفلسطيني عن الاقتصاد الإسرائيلي، ولا إنه تنفصل الضفة الغربية وغزة عن إسرائيل، مع أن إسرائيل حاولت تعمل تستغني عن غزة، بس الهدف هو يعني إعادة تركيبة التبعية الفلسطينية على إسرائيل. التبعية اللي إسرائيل كانت بدها تمارسها ومارستها بعد أوسلو، إنه أنتوا بديروا بالكم على أموركم وأنا بدير بالي على أموري، بس أنا مهيمنة اقتصاديا. وطبعا إحنا بنعرف السياسات الاقتصادية والسياسية الإسرائيلية هي اللي حدثت من تطور الاقتصاد الفلسطيني. بس أنا اللي عم بقوله بعد 30 سنة محاولة بناء دولة فلسطينية، وهذا كتاب عالجها، باجي لنقطة الدكتور أبو ستة، إنه إحنا فكرنا إنه بناء دولة فلسطينية يعني استقلال فلسطيني، وقبلنا بالمعضلة وبالقرار الدولي، لأنه بترجع على نقطتك. كان في قرار دولي من وقت التقسيم إنه الحل الوحيد لصراع العرب الإسرائيلي هو مفهومة الدول القومية، واحنا قبلنا بقرار التقسيم وقبلنا بقرار 242 مع انه لانه هو صار المعضله الاساسيه هي اي حل سلمي في المنطقه مبني على قصه الارض بمقابل السلام، انه قبلنا بدوله صغيره بالضفه الغربيه غزه على اساس انه من هاي الدوله ممكن نعمل استقلال سياسي. اللي اتضح انه مشروع الدوله الفلسطينيه ما كانش غلط، بس ادى دور تاريخي، هذا اللي بناقشه بكتابي الاخير. أدى دور تاريخي إنه هو أثبت الوجود الفلسطيني، وجود السياسة الفلسطيني، إنه في إحنا موجودين سياسياً، إحنا مش قضية إنسانية بدها حل إنساني زي ما قال قرار الأمم المتحدة 242، إحنا شعب عندنا حق تقرير المصير. وفكرنا من خلال الدولة من غير ما نعالج الصهيونية زي ما أنت قلت، إحنا فكرنا بحل التقسيم إنه هو أسهل من حل الدولة الواحدة لأنه إسرائيل مش هتقبل فيه. أوكي إحنا بنحكيش بالصهيونية، أنتوا بتفكوا عنا دولتين وكل واحد بيعيش له، بس هاي ما بتزبطش. بعد 30 سنة فهمنا اللي وصلنا له اعتراف دولي شامل بأحقية الشعب الفلسطيني بحقوقه، وهذا بنشوفه اليوم بالشارع العالمي. يعني رغم الخذلان العربي وكمان السياسة الأمريكية كيف نقول، بس واضح إنه اليوم بعد 75 سنة نكبة، وزي ما إحنا عم نعيش نكبة تانية عمرنا ما تخيلنا إنه ممكن نعيشها بهذا الخزم اللي رايحة بالمفهوم الإحلالي. إنه إحنا موجودين وإننا حقوق، والكل صار يحكي فيها. في بفلسطين اليوم في 14 مليون، 7 مليون يهود و7 مليون فلسطينية. 7 مليون يهود عندهم حقوق، ال7 الفلسطينية فيش عندهم حقوق أو متوزعين. السؤال كيف نمشي لقدام؟ أظن لازم إحنا كفلسطينية كمشروع وطني فلسطيني إنه نقبل إنه مشروع الدولة الفلسطينية فشل، أدى دوره التاريخي إنه أثبت وجودنا، إنه أثبت أحقيتنا، أثبت وجودنا كشعب عنده حقوق سياسية. بس أكتر ما فيهوش يعطي التحرر لأنه مركب على منظومة استعمارية. فهلا لازم نبلش نعمل إشي كيف بدنا نبلش ننهي الاستعمار. بالناحية الاقتصادية الطريقة الوحيدة إنه نمكن شعبنا على الأرض، وما منمكنه عن طريق الديون، ما منمكنه عن طريق يعني شو اسمه عملة فلسطينية. العملة الفلسطينية لا حتقدم ولا حتأخر، لأنه المطروح هلا يامنا يشبك الضفة مع الأردن وغزة مع إسرائيل وهيك بننهي الموضوع، بس ما أظنش حينتهي لأنه الكل عم بيقولوا مش ولا حد بده إيانا. عم نرجع على معضلة 48 بناحية معينة، أو على أنا اللي بشوفها كحقبة تاريخية إحنا زي 73 في تحول جذري عم بيصير. فالسؤال الدور الاقتصادي تمكين الشعب الفلسطيني وتمكينه على أرضه بسياسات اقتصادية مش استهلاكية، هذا هو النقطة الأساسية. وأظن الدخول مع الداخل كتير مهم. بس بالنسبة لنقطة تعوصة إنه الجينوسايد، أنا بستبعد، يعني طبعاً في عنا حرب إبادة هلأ عم بتصير علينا، بس إصرار شعبنا يضلوا على أرضه هذا إشي الإسرائيليين ما فيهم مش يهدموه، حيكلفوه، حنتكلف كتير، هذا بدون شك. بس إحنا في حقبة تاريخية جديدة مهمة جداً، وفي عنا مكاسب، عنا ثمن غالي عم يندفع، بس في عنا مكاسب لازم نعرف كيف نوجهها بالاتجاه الصحيح.
طيب دقيقة معي بس. So very quickly, I talk about the popular sovereignty in the book. Bishara, Anderson, they use it. They're substantively close, but the reason that I don't use popular sovereignty is because it is wedded to the notion of a people as understood within the Euro-American nation state. So the people are necessarily part of a regime of citizenship that benefits from the imperial wealth generated by the state. So that's why I shift to decolonial sovereignties, because it more explicitly critiques colonialism and imperialism. And in terms of the international legal system, where has it gotten us? Making the argument of this Euro-American sovereignty in this international legal system as nowhere. So we take it on. That's what I'm saying, is that I don't recognize the international system's recognition of who gets to be sovereign. And there are many people around the world that can join us with that. So those are the ties that I want to make. And with, thank you. And with, absolutely agree with de-Zionization. I agree with the PLO position in the 1960s and 1970s. If the Israelis want to join us, they've got to renounce Zionism. There's no other way. De-Zionization is the only path forward. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, just quickly. So the competition starts 2016, 2017, and it's still the present. As far as Zukhrut is concerned, it's mentioned in other parts of the study. This is just a sort of select, zoom in for the sake of today. That said, despite its mention in other parts of the study, I make a particular point, and I would encourage us all to credit the work more of Nakba survivors who have been writing and publishing hundreds of village histories. I know you know this, and Abu Sitta and PLS and others' data and map collection, with which Zukhrut would have had nothing to begin. And so, yeah, I mean, it is, Zukhrut as an organization is mentioned in its early projects, but I focus more on sort of the indigenous stuff. No, it's totally legitimate question. Dr. Abu Sitta, what it means, if anything, to the villagers and the instance of the presentation to Sahmata, for example, several years ago, we found that the exchange, when that happened, was very focused on specific questions came from the descendants, largely because it takes time, I think, to wrap your mind around the idea of the project, right? لكن بآخر 3 سنين, some of the submissions have actually shifted in designing the villages, of students having the opportunity to work on their own villages, which has not been previously present, not because of any reason other than there are so many villages that every year PLS has decided to make available like 20 or 30 villages as an option for the competition, because if they drop all 480 files at once, it just becomes too hard to manage. So as participants start to work on their own villages, we're also seeing different processes, which include family incorporation, of going out actually into their camps and into their communities and talking to people as a part of the design. For those who have physical access to spaces, or for those who have connections in order to be able to zoom in, they're starting to also include interviews with descendants as part of the design. So we're seeing some of this sort of develop as the competition goes, and as I mentioned earlier, a very strong shift from singular individual submissions to now, last year, almost every submission was a group submission. So we're seeing sort of more collective endeavors as part of the project too.
I know there were a few more questions, and I know we're over time, so we're going to do a quick fire round. So if you can keep your questions very, very short. The lady in the back.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this very rich conversation. I'm Azadeh, a researcher based in Ireland. My question was to Mohanad. I've worked in Palestinian refugee camps in Baddawi, Shatila, and Nahr al-Barid. What you shared with me had a great resonance in terms of how the sovereignty is being created by popular committees inside a camp, by NGOs, by local collectives and groups that are not even part of the wider international fundings. So I was wondering, how would you see that recreation of organizational space within the camps, like a camp with an area of only 1 square kilometer has more than 40 organizations running it, and how creative the space is being organized in terms of countering the international humanitarian work, and how they are kind of featuring a different kind of sovereignty. Would that include the kind of decoloniality that you imagine?
Thank you. There's a gentleman here, and then behind him as well.
يعطيك العافية دكتورة. يعطيكم العافية جميعا. طبعا سؤالي للدكتورة ليلى. أولا دكتورة كنت حابب بس تعلقي على أموال المقاصة. أموال المقاصة بتعرفوا بتمثل تقريبا 60% حاليا من إيرادات السلطة، وتستخدم لها دور يعني في ابتزاز السلطة لتعزيز الأمن. وفي صفقة القرن لما أعلنت السلطة وقف التنسيق الأمني، رجعت بالضبط أعادت إحيائه بعد 5 أشهر و29 يوم. السبب في ذلك أنه في اتفاقية باريس إذا أنت استنكفت عن أخذ أموالك المقاصة لمدة 6 أشهر فبتسقط عنك، بتبطل حق لك. فبالتالي اضطرت السلطة الفلسطينية إنها تعيد التنسيق الأمني. فحابب تعليقك عن هذا الموضوع، خاصة إحنا بنحكي في 250 ألف تقريبا موظف في السلطة الفلسطينية، وتقريبا 200 ألف واحد يشتغلوا في الداخل، ففي ارتباط بنيوي. السؤال الثاني حول القوى العاملة في القطاع الزراعي. لفت نظري جدا الرسم البياني انه في عام 1991 كان تقريبا 25% من القوى البشريه يشتغلوا في القطاع الزراعي، وما كان في ارقام، لكن انا قدرت انها وصلت تقريبا 7% في عام 2019. سؤالي حول هذا الموضوع، بتقديرك ما هي الاسباب حول هذا الامر؟ هل هي مرتبطه باسباب موضوعيه بمعنى الاحتلال والتمدد الاستيطان والسيطره على الاراضي الزراعيه، ام انها ايضا مرتبطه باسباب ذاتيه مرتبطه بالسلطه الفلسطينيه وتركيزها على الخدمات اكثر من تركيزها على القطاع الزراعي، او كلاهما؟ شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا.
صباح الخير، يعطيكم العافية جميعا. بفكر 3 مداخلات ممتازة، حتى كان لازم كل واحدة تتناقش بندوة لحال، وبتثير كتير أسئلة. أول شيء بالنسبة لبروفيسور فرسخ، أنا بحب أني أسمع رأيك. أنا بفكر إنه إسرائيل عملت شغلة غير عن إيش إحنا عادة بنتعلم بالعلوم السياسية بموضوع كسر المعادلة هاي تبعت الحاجة لاستقرار سياسي من أجل نمو اقتصادي. إسرائيل كل الوقت في حالة عدم استقرار سياسي، وفي السنوات الأخيرة كل الوقت في نمو اقتصادي. يمكن هلأ الحالة هاي حالة شوي خاصة، ولكن ال4 حروبات اللي قبل كانت على غزة، وقابلها 2006 لبنان، وقابلها الانتفاضة الثانية. احنا 20 سنة في حالة عدم، يعني أنا بفكر نتنياهو وقيادة الاقتصاد بإسرائيل قدروا يكسروا هاي المعادلة. الفكرة انه في حاجة لاستقرار سياسي من اجل نمو اقتصادي. بحب اسمع رأيك بهذا الموضوع. انا بفكر اسرائيل كسرت هاي المعادلة. ومهند انا يعني in the last 2 decades يعني everybody is using this methodology and comparison with Zionism and other settler colonial projects. It's good, it's important, bringing us a lot of new ideas, but I think there are 2 important challenges in this thing that we should also consider. First, Zionism did not kill all the Palestinians. The rest of the European settler colonial projects killed nearly all the natives, then they became humans. Lately, after killing everyone, they started being able to reconsider the rights of the Indian. So demography here is something totally different. And in historical Palestine, there's a majority of Palestinians. So the development of the future of the settler colonial project is going to be different. This is one. The other 2 very important component is geography. Palestine is not Canada. In Canada, they can give the indigenous population 1 million square kilometers to play there the way they like to. They will still have another 9 million kilometers. Geography in Palestine is something totally different. So 2 very important components in thinking about statehood or any other kind of sovereignty. We should take into consideration the different situation in this settler colonial project of geography and of demography. So I would like to hear what you think about it. And the last thing I want to say for Noor, what Arij mentioned was the work of the Khrot. I was in the first discussion. When they started this kind of projects of imagining a right of return. You know, the first discussion, to see how full of contradictions the whole discussion was in the American Zionist house in northern Tel Aviv, nearby a destroyed Palestinian village, nearby Sumer. The first discussion was there. And I think there are two very big challenges for us when we are talking about the right of return that I did not hear anything in your paper. Maybe you wrote it in different chapters. First, we as Palestinians, we must also have the answer for the question, what do we want to do with the settlers? We are talking about the right of return, Mumtaz. The settlers are not going to disappear. There are millions of them spread all over Palestine. So in the right of return, we should also have an answer first. What should we do with the settlers? And the other thing, which is not less important, imagine that all the Palestinians from Jordan will go up tomorrow morning to Palestine. What will happen to Jordan? Not just to Palestine.
Thank you.
So the right of return might also mean, and if not in bringing the discussion into rationalization, might also mean another catastrophe for the Palestinians and for those who will be leaving from their areas.
Thank you. I'm sorry to end the conversation here. I'm going to give the panelists 30 seconds each to answer because the next panel is starting in a few minutes. And I mean 30 seconds.
So جوابي السريع وممكن أن نحكي برا إنه الهدف من إسرائيل واللي صار معنا إسرائيل بدها تهمش القضية الفلسطينية، تفتت الشعب الفلسطيني وتخلق تبعيات جديدة. فالمقاصة وكل هذا ناتج على إنه أنت عم تخلق تبعيات جديدة لا على إسرائيل. وقف هون.
For the first question, you can teach me more about it than I can, so let's have a conversation about it. For the second one, there's all sorts of geography, demographics, techniques of expulsion, You can compare different settler colonies, but just because Canada looked one way doesn't mean that Zionism is not another way. There's French settler colonialism in Algeria, British and Dutch settler colonialism in South Africa. They tried settler colonialism all over the world. It wasn't just in Canada and the US, so it's a long discussion, but the debate is settled within settler colonial studies.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the question of where settlers go, I mean, as far as this competition is concerned, there's a very specific reason that they're focused on the destroyed villages that still stand on empty land. And as far as the cities are concerned, I don't think that we should be making assumptions about settler permanence. They are not all going to go somewhere, but we also shouldn't be living in a world of a fait accompli, as if it's just a given of what the future looks like and how many will remain. It is a question that we will all have to grapple with, and it is a part of the conversation that exists in other parts of the study, as well as this competition. But to say that every part of our imagining has to take them into account is, I don't even know the word of level of offensive or absurdity that comes with that. So I'll leave that there.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Muhannad, Noor, Layla.